Hi there, welcome to Floating in Books. Today's video is going to be all about 10 book series that nobody else is talking about, but that I love, or that I think I'm going to love. We have like one honorable mention, you could say, because I haven't read it yet, but the other 9 are all things that I love and adore, and I just feel that the online book community needs to talk about them a little bit more. So let's get cracking. In case you're new here, hi, my name is Micah. I like to come on here once a week to chat about books, but also do some lifestyle-related videos and some like fashion content from time to time. This is sort of like my catch-all channel where I do anything that doesn't go onto my main channel, which is all makeup focused. So that's why I have this second side gig, you could say, where I just like to chat about some things a bit more casual. We're sitting in front of the bookcases again because I thought it worked. So that's why we're just going to get on with these 10 series. Now I'm gonna start us off with the honorable mention just to get it out of the way, and I'm not really sure anymore how to categorize this because I think I found this in the fantasy section, but it also sounds historical fiction at the same time. So this is the Rotherweird trilogy by Andrew Caldecot. I have all 3 books in the series and I've never read it, but it sounded really intriguing. It's sort of like set in the 16th century in England, and it's this Tudor town of Rotherweird, and it says here, 4.5 centuries on, cast adrift from the rest of England by Elizabeth I and still bound by its ancient laws, Rotherweird's independence is subject to one disturbing condition. Nobody studies the town or its history. Then an outsider arrives, a man of unparalleled wealth and power, enough to buy the whole of Rotherweird, deeply buried secrets and all. So it's sort of giving me fantasy-esque kind of vibes, but at the same time it's like really much set in history. I think that that's what we're going to get from this. And I just thought this could be cool. I've never heard anybody talking about it, and then the books are really cool because they have the sprayed edges. I think they all have that, all 3 of my editions. And it's just something I once stumbled upon at a Waterstones in Amsterdam, and I just ended up buying the other books in the series because I was so intrigued by it. But because of my reading slump that happened, well, by now almost 2 years ago, I didn't really catch up on things that I bought at the time. So it was very much like on the radar to be reading then, but I didn't get around to it yet. But it sounds so intriguing, and I don't think I've ever seen anybody talk about this. So I'm here for it. This is definitely one I need to put on a TBR at some point, but I just showed you my TBR for 2023 like last week, and this isn't on there yet because I have a couple of other series that I want to prioritize over this. But maybe once I get around to it, I might actually, hopefully before the end of the year, I might be able to start this series for sure. The other 9 series I have here for you, I've all read, and with most of them, I've either completed them or I'm pretty much caught up with where the book series has left off, save for one. And one I have to, this is the reason why I wanted to make this video, because I finally found someone on Book Talk who loves the Rivers of London series by Ben Aaronovitch as much as I do. And it's the first time I've ever seen another book creator talk about this. Even though it's a bestseller series and it's got a lot of hype in like other reading communities, but online this is just not talked about because it isn't high fantasy, it is urban fantasy. So let me tell you what the Rivers of London series is about if you've never heard of it before. This is about a police constable called Peter Grant, and in this first novel we meet him as he's just graduated police academy, and on one of his first patrols he comes across magic, and he finds out he can detect magic, and then he's introduced to this special part of the London police force where they do anything that has to do with things supernatural. And that's the premise for the rest of the series. He goes on different cases. He becomes a more and more advanced magician as time goes on. These books have some really killer representation. The main character himself is his parents are from Sierra Leone. He's not from like a privileged background. He's really had to fight his way to where he is today. And there's a lot of characters we meet along the way that have like similar backgrounds to it. So it's very much sort of, I've always described this as like Luther meets Sherlock Holmes meets Harry Potter. That's sort of the vibe you get in here. Each book is also set in a different area of London. So if you're familiar with the city, it's like being taken on a trip through London as you read all of the different books. I think there are 10 of these right now out. And whenever a new one comes out, I buy it straight away. I prioritize it straight away. They are all 5-star reads for me. They are really fast-paced. They're action-packed. Ben Aaronovitch actually wrote on TV shows before, so he knows how to write a compelling story and also have it come to life for you. There's a lot of like references to nerd culture in here. In the first book, we get a lot of like mythology woven into it as well. So each book also has its own sort of flair. And I don't always like the premise of every single one, and by now, because I read them so quickly, I do feel everything has started to muddle together. So one of my long-term goals is to give the entire series a reread and go back to the first one, because I also ended up reading a couple out of order because I wasn't aware of the order when I first started reading the series. So I know some of the earlier books I didn't read in the order they're supposed to go in. So I do want to give this a reread. This is one of my most beloved series, and if you haven't picked it up yet, I highly recommend. Then 2 books that I already showed you last week as like series I need to go back to, but 2 of my long-running series that I still love and adore are Genevieve Cogman's The Invisible Library and the Jim Butcher Dresden Files. So these are still ongoing series. I actually believe there hasn't been a book out in this one. I looked it up again to see where I had left off and how many books there were. I only didn't read the last 2 that have come out, but since 2021, not a single book has come out in the Invisible Library series. So I'm not sure whether that one is finished, because it didn't really say anything on the author's website, but it seems she started a new series. So it could very well be that it's just the new series from now on and there are no more books coming in the Invisible Library series. But yeah, I do own all of these books. Like I said, I've only not read the last 2, and this is one of my favorite. If you like cozy fantasy stories, pick this up, please. It's not like, nothing in here is too exciting. There aren't like any big murders. There's nothing too grisly going on in these. But these are just really, really cleverly done, and they're just really, again, very quick-paced fantasy reads where we get different realms in each book. In the Invisible Library series, we meet Irene, and in the first book, she has just finished her training as a librarian for the Invisible Library. And the Invisible Library in this series is like this... It's like a library that maintains peace around the world, you could say, and they have to find books in different realms to take back to the library to make sure this order stays balanced. And the reason why the order doesn't always stay balanced is because we have fairies and dragons in this world who sort of battle things out. The fairies are chaotic, the dragons are high order, and these 2 things really clashes, and the Invisible Library is sort of like trying to hold everything together. And these different realms are sometimes worlds that we are familiar with, but there's always something there that is a little bit different. So this first one is set in like a Victorian London kind of setting, so 19th century London, but with a lot of steampunk punk elements because there's much more advanced technology than the Victorian era actually had. But at the same time, we get like, you know, one book is set in like a version of Venice, and then we have one that's set in like 1920 Chicago with like gangsters and like automatic rifles and those kind of things. So they, like, each book again has its own little setting, but it's more like a different world. And we meet all of these like fantastical characters along the way. Some of them very much inspired by other literary characters that you may be familiar with. There's a very, very strong reference to Sherlock Holmes in these books because we do meet a Sherlock Holmesian kind of character in the first book already. And he's like a character that comes back a few times. There isn't a lot of romance in these books either, which I adore. It's very much about the adventure, going on these cases, finding these books. There's an arch nemesis at a certain point that we need to battle a couple of times. These are just really fun reads, and again, something I don't hear enough people talking about. Then I think a very popular series, because it's the longest running fantasy series in the world. I think there are over 20 books in this series. I've only read the first 4, but it's the Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, and in this series we meet Harry Dresden. He is a magician for hire. That's how he makes his living in Chicago. Again, it's urban fantasy, which I believe, like, I don't know why, but for some reason, also on Book Talk, but also on BookTube, back when I was watching that a bit more, nobody was really into urban fantasy, but that's the kind of fantasy that I like best. Granted, the Jim Butcher Dresden Files are, you know, you need to get through a couple of things. There aren't like major trigger warnings or anything like that, but it is a male main character who has a pretty misogynistic view of the world. Like, he's not very respectful to women, which is why a lot of the women creators I've watched dislike this series. But I feel that the writing and the way things are described get better with each book I've read in this series. So you definitely need to give it time, because apparently Jim Butcher started writing this when he was just in college, and we get like a new book like every year or two. So this has been going on for such a long time, and the writing seems to be getting better and better and better, and this series becomes more sprawling and epic and more world building as things go along. So if you love world building, I feel that's the same thing for the Ben Aaronovitch Rivers of London series, where we only get this much of the world in the first book. But then with each book, the world expands and we get more of the politics and we get more of the things going on. Whereas with, for instance, with a Brandon Sanderson, we get the world building right off the bat, like we're in the world. And with these, it's like, it's all like hidden away. It's like a world we aren't familiar with, but it's very much like one foot in our world, and that's why we're introduced to it slowly. And I feel that works really well for me, because I was, especially when I first started reading fantasy books, I was not into the high fantasy, like medieval setting with dragons and knights, and it's just not my thing. But this I love. It's, again, action-packed. I love Bob. So in this series, he doesn't have a computer, because technology and magic don't go together. So instead, he has a talking skeleton in his office, and it's called Bob. And he's like witty and like, dude, what the hell are you doing? So I love a lot of the side characters that are in this book more so than I do the main character. But that's why I want to keep reading. So yeah, I love the Dresden Files. This was recommended to me by a friend, and I've been reading a book pretty much once a year-ish. I need to get, like, that's why I put it on my 2023 TBR. I need to get back to that, and these are great summer reads. If you want to take something quick and easy with you to the beach, I don't like romance, I read these things. And it's about time that I talked again about this series, because this is now on Netflix. I'm so happy. Lockwood & Co. by Jonathan Stroud. Now, this is a YA series, and I don't love a lot of YA. I have really found that it's just not quite for me, because I find it too formulaic. But this was so good, and I've been raving about it for so long, and nobody else talks about it. And I'm like, this just needs some loving again. And now you can watch the first series, which is the first 2 books of the 5-book series. I hope they keep it going and that they are going to renew the series for another series. So if you want to know what this is about and you're not much of a reader and you just want to watch it, watch the TV series. I felt it was pretty true to what the books have to offer. They go over some things a little too quickly, I find, especially the first book. Like, the case was wrapped up a little too easily and neatly with a bow. In the books, it's a bit messier and a bit more, like, less straightforward. But I find that that happens with a lot of, like, book to film or TV adaptations. But yeah, Lockwood & Co. is set in this world where instead of us living our lives the way we do now, a problem occurred, and that problem has to do with ghosts appearing everywhere, and we get these ghost hunting agencies that need to take care of the problem. Lockwood & Co. is the only teenage-run ghost hunting business there is, because the trick with these ghosts is that adults cannot see them. So after a certain period in your life, you stop seeing these, and not everybody is born with being able to see them. But if you can see them, you're a child or a teenager. And that's definitely something that then plays into this. And these agencies are run by adults, but they need the children to do the work for them, etc., etc. We meet Lucy, our main character, who joins Lockwood & Co., and from there the adventure starts. The first book in the series is called The Screaming Staircase, and it has to do with the main case that they are going on about. They're just getting started, so they need all the exposure they can get, and they're sort of being tricked into doing this pretty nasty job. And that I think does come forward in the TV series as well. These are really fun, really witty, again, action-packed, really, really cool. Again, each book has sort of like a main case, but when you read all 5 books in this series, there is an overarching narrative that brings them all together. So that's perhaps good to know as well. So even though you could read each book individually, there is like an overarching storyline that ties them all together, which I thought was also cleverly done. It's not overly romantic for a YA. I find it's much more focused around friendship and just really good characters that are really well fleshed out. So I love this little series. Perhaps a bit of a controversial one, but I set myself to finally finish reading the Nevernight trilogy by J. Kristoff last year, and this was a book series that I already started years before, and I was like, right, I just need to get to it and read the other 2 in the series. I really like this. Now, apparently the author has said or done some things that a lot of people disagree with. I've tried finding out what it is he did, and I can't really find it. So that's why I'm like, okay, I know something happened, but I'm not exactly sure what. So that's why I'm like, I like the books, and I'm just going to be reviewing the books as is, separately from whoever wrote them. But yeah, the Nevernight trilogy by J. Kristoff features Mia, and this world is sort of like ancient Rome with like a different religion. We get some assassins here as well, and that's how we meet Mia, because she is set to revenge her parents. They were killed by the administrators of this world, and she has a bone to pick with them. So she joins the Red Church to be trained as an assassin in the first book, and then as the books continue, we still are on this revenge arc. So that revenge story is sort of what ties everything together. My favorite book in the series was the second one, because that's sort of like Hunger Games-esque, with like gladiator kind of games that she joins. And Mia also has some special powers, which makes her a little bit more special than some of the other characters here. And these books are, again, action-packed, but there is some repetition in the writing. So some of the writing can feel a little bit formulaic at times and a little lazy. So I understand why people don't love this series to begin with. And the first book, not sure if I can find a page where this happens. Let me see. Yeah, so the first book has like massive footnotes, and if you don't read the footnotes, you will miss a lot of the world building, and because of those footnotes, it does feel like a very slow-paced book because of it. But the second book doesn't have it as much, so that's why I don't mind it. And it's also revealed in the third book who actually wrote the stories, which I thought was cool. So again, there is this like underlying like narrative that ties all 3 books together, but I feel you could read just one. If you want to read just one, read the second one. You'll miss some of the world building and some of the like character development, but I felt that in terms of what happens, that's the best one. Like storytelling wise, it's got the best devices. This was a bit slow at times because of all the world building that happens in the footnotes, and if you don't read them, then a lot of things in the second and third book may not make sense. So that's the downside of this series, but I really enjoyed these. I don't like Mia as a character, but here I am telling you that I love unlikable characters. Like, I love them if they are gray and they make bad decisions and it's not clear why they take those decisions. I love that about characters. I think that makes them more human. I don't need all the explaining in the world. I don't mind it if they have bad motivations for why they do certain things. So for me, this was perfect from that perspective, but I can understand why people don't like this. Then another one that a lot of people didn't like, and that's the Red Queen Quartet. It's 4 books by Victoria Aveyard. And I do think she has some other writing out since then, but I've never picked it up again. This is again YA. And this was one of the first YA series I read that when I read it was incredibly popular on Book Talk and BookTube at the time mainly. And so many people, as the series progressed, were saying how they didn't like it as much anymore, how it felt too much like things they had already read. But here's the thing, I started reading this when I first started reading YA, and I think that that has really skewed how I feel about this series, that maybe if I were to read it now, I wouldn't like it as much, because it is a bit tropey. It definitely is. And that was the main gripe that a lot of people had with this one. But I liked it because I wasn't as familiar with the tropes of YA fantasy yet when I read this, and that's why I really did enjoy it. I did read Hunger Games and things like the Lunar Chronicles and like other really popular YA trilogies and series at the time that I read this. For me, this is the one that has stuck with me. Not the Lunar Chronicles, not the Hunger Games. This is the one that really in my brain comes to the forefront as one of the better YA series I have ever read. We meet, her name is Mare, right? I believe she's called Mare. It's been a while since I read this. But our main character lives in a world where people have silver or red blood, and people with silver blood have magic powers, and they're the ones in power, and they kind of use people with red blood as cannon fodder in these wars that make no sense. But then at some point in time, Mare finds out that even though she's red-blooded, she does have powers, and that there are more reds with power, and then we get rebellion, and like that's the part that feels very Hunger Game-esque. And then, of course, we have two brothers who are on the throne, and then one of them, like, it's the whole thing. There is some, like, allusion to romance, and especially the third book in this series was a choice. It was a choice. She's pretty much, like, locked up in a prison for most of the third book, which makes it really, really claustrophobic to read. But I remember that one of the things I really liked about this series was the fourth book, because it was for the first time a YA series that didn't try to wrap everything up nicely with a bow around it and like, oh, and they lived happily ever after. It didn't go like that. Plus, I felt that the the bad guys in the series were also like really murky. Like they were bad because they didn't really have a choice that they were bad. Like it all felt a little bit more well done and a little less surface level than I felt most YA that I've read did. I'm not sure, again, like I already mentioned, how I would feel about this if I read it again now. Maybe I don't like it as much, but I remember back when I was reading this, it just has stood the test of time for me, and it's still on my shelves because I can see myself rereading this at some point, if that makes sense. And finally, a couple of series that are more historical-esque. The Yard series from Alex Grecian, again, something I never hear anybody talking about. This is set around, like, one of the first police, like, when London got a police force in, like, the late 19th century. So it's London in the 19th century, which I love. And we meet these, like, police officers just off of, you know, Jack the Ripper happening and all of that. So it's sort of like 1 foot in history, but also 1 foot fantastical. I did feel that after reading like 4 of these, there was a little too much of a focus on Jack the Ripper, which to me felt a bit like a sellout, but especially the first 2 books were really, really good historical fiction novels. The Yard is really about how they need to like earn their respect, and then the second one is actually not set in London, but more so in like an industrialized area of England in that time period. It very nicely highlights some of the social discussions that were going on at the time, and yeah, I really enjoyed these books, but again, nobody ever talks about them. Another book series I showed you I need to finish this year is the Strings of Murder quintet, because it's 5 books or 6, I don't know. There's a few books in this series by Oscar de Muriel. So if you've been here for a while, you know how much I love this because I feature this book series in many of my videos. This is the Frey and McGray series. And this is about 2 police officers in Edinburgh in the 19th century. And each case they tackle starts off with something that sounds supernatural, but then there is like a technological advancement from the time that can explain how things work. And one of our police officers on this team is the one that believes in the supernatural, and the other one is more skeptical, and one of them is a bit older, and the other is not younger, and they have this banter, and it's very sort of like Holmes and Watson and whatever. This is great. This is really, really great. I love how the characters work together. Again, as you read more and more of these books, you start finding that there is some sort of like line tying them all together, but I haven't really come to the conclusion yet, so I hope this happens in the last book. how it all ties together, and it has to do with one of the main character's sisters. Like, his sister went mad at some point and hacked off part of his fingers. So that's sort of what happened, but her storyline comes back in like a little bit in each book. So I think that that's a little bit more important than it might seem at first. So this goes into like banshees and witchcraft and all of this lovely things. And it's always like, this is a little darker than a lot of the other fantasy stuff I talked about today. Like, this definitely has like, you know, crime and murder at its heart. So if you're a bit squeamish, this may not be for you, because they do go to these murder cases and you do like get the entire like description of how it went down. But yeah, these are really fun, and I love how the author has really done his research, because it all feels very authentic and historical, but then we get that fun bit at the end every time with the resolving of the case, always centered around this technological like revelation of the time, which I think is really clever. So yeah, these books are really enjoyable, and I love the banter between these two characters. And last but not least, Jacoby by William Ritter. This is another YA series, and this is one, again, that I've never heard anybody talking about. This is a little, like, the world building in this, I feel, is a little less strong with some of the other ones, but the characters are super duper fun. So this is centered about our main character, Jacoby, who is a private investigator before there were really any private investigators in a New England town. What is it called? New Fiddleham. Again, 19th century setting, but this has fantastical elements. So Jacoby is a investigator who, again, has this tie with the supernatural world. We are involved with vampires at some point. There are some fairies and fae involved at some point. This is a 4-book series. Just as I was trying to finish off what I was trying to say about this book, the doorbell rang and the groceries came today. So if the angle looks different, that's why. But I was saying about Jacoby that it's told from the perspective of a female who's like raised in a more well-off family, but I think her family became a bit down on their luck, and they're trying to marry her off to someone who's much richer to keep the money in the family, and she's just not into it. So she got on a boat to New England, and right as she gets off the boat, she meets Jacoby and she becomes his assistant. I think she befriends a ghost at some point, just to give you an example of what's happening in these stories. So yeah, these are fun, really easy reads, and I really enjoyed these, and this book series just deserves a bit more loving. So those were the 10 books that I wanted to mention in today's video. These are 10 book series that I feel just need a bit more loving in the online book community, because I've never heard anybody talking about these, save for myself and like one other person. So that's why I thought I could come on here and share some love and hopefully give you some ideas of books you might want to pick up. Some of these series are long running, as I already mentioned, and there's a lot of books here that you could potentially read if you were to get into some of these. So I really hope you enjoyed watching today. I will be back next week with a new video, so I hope you'd like to stay tuned for that, because I'm going to be telling you about all the books that I read in the past couple of weeks. So I'm super excited for that, because I definitely got some reading done, so I'm happy about that. So hope to see you next week. Bye-bye!